Mastering the CECDW framework. Welcome to this training session on mastering the CECDW framework. CECDW is a sequential pedagogical framework for presenting English vocabulary and grammar in a clear and systematic way. The 5 stages are C. Contextualization, E. Elicitation, C. Concept checking, D. Drilling, W. Writing. The main purpose of this framework is to reduce guessing and make language presentation more predictable for both the teacher and the learner. Instead of simply showing students a new word and asking, "What does this mean?" we first create a meaningful context, guide students toward the target language, check whether they really understand it, practice the pronunciation, and finally establish the written form. In this video, we will look at each stage and then see how the complete framework works with real classroom examples. The lesson flow sequence. This slide shows the complete lesson flow. The sequence is contextualization, elicitation, concept checking, drilling, and writing. First, we establish the context. This gives students a reason to think about the language. Next comes elicitation. We prompt students to produce or guess the target word. Then we use concept checking questions, or CCQs, to verify that students understand the meaning. After that, we move to drilling, where students practice the pronunciation. Finally, we introduce the written form. An important principle here is that CECDW is presented as a single chronological flow. In other words, we should not randomly jump between the stages. For example, if I am teaching the word briefcase, I should not immediately write briefcase on the board before students have understood the word. Instead, I can first show a picture of a briefcase, create a context, elicit the word, check its meaning, drill the pronunciation, and then write it. This creates a clear learning sequence. Context is the non-negotiable foundation. The first stage is contextualization, and we can describe context as the foundation of the whole process. The key idea is simple. We should not introduce new language without first establishing a meaningful context. The 4 possible anchors for context are railia, picture, situation, and story. Let's look at them. First, railia. It means using real objects in the classroom. For example, if you are teaching the word umbrella, you can actually bring an umbrella into the classroom. Second, we can use a picture. If you are teaching briefcase, you can show students a clear picture of a briefcase. Third, we can create a situation. For example, you might say, imagine you are going to an important business meeting. You are carrying your laptop and some documents. This situation can lead students toward the word briefcase. Finally, we can use a story. For example, yesterday, Ahmed went to a business meeting. He wore a suit and carried a black bag for his laptop and documents. The important point is that context should help students understand what the language is about before we ask them to produce the target word. The 30-second elicitation loop. After establishing context, we move to elicitation. The purpose of elicitation is to give students an opportunity to produce the target language themselves. For example, imagine that I show students a picture of a briefcase. I might say, "It is a bag. You take it to work. It starts with B." Then I wait. Students might say, "Bag, box." Eventually, someone may say, "Briefcase." Excellent. We have successfully elicited the word. However, do not turn elicitation into an endless guessing game. The suggested limit is about 30 seconds. If students do not produce the word after a reasonable attempt, the teacher should provide the word and move on. Why? Because our goal is teaching the language, not testing how long students can guess. So remember, elicit, but do not over-elicit. Give students a chance to think, but if they do not know the word, provide it and continue with concept checking. The CCQ diagnostic filter. Now we come to the second C in CEDW framework, concept checking. But we do not necessarily need CCQs for every single word. We can ask ourselves, is the meaning universally obvious? For example, Consider the word glasses. If students see a clear picture of ordinary glasses, they may already understand what the object is. In this situation, asking several CCQs may be unnecessary. However, consider the word iPod. Students from different backgrounds may not be familiar with this object or its purpose. So simply asking students to repeat the word does not tell us whether they understand it. This is where CCQs become useful. The teacher needs to diagnose whether there is a possibility of misunderstanding. So before asking a CCQ, ask yourself, could my students misunderstand this meaning? If the answer is no, we may not need extensive concept checking. If the answer is yes, we should use targeted CCQs. Engineering the perfect CCQ. So, what makes a good CCQ? Use targeted, simple, binary questions. Let's take the example of an iPod. Suppose I show students a picture and they correctly say, iPod. Do they really understand what an iPod is? We can check by asking, do we use it for calling people? Students answer, no. Then, do we use it for listening to music? Students answer, yes. These questions are much more useful than simply asking, do you understand what an iPod is? Why? Because students can say, yes, even when they do not actually understand. A good CCQ gives us evidence of understanding. So when designing CCQs, keep the questions short, simple, specific, and easy to answer. Whenever possible, use yes, no, or binary choices. For example, is it big or small? Do we wear it or carry it? Is it used inside or outside? These questions allow the teacher to diagnose understanding quickly. The pronunciation drilling funnel. Once meaning has been established, we move to drilling. We can describe this as a drilling funnel. We begin broadly and gradually move toward individual performance. First comes teacher modeling. The teacher clearly pronounces the target word 3 times. For example, briefcase, briefcase, briefcase. Students listen carefully. Next comes choral drilling. The whole class repeats, briefcase. Then we move to group drilling. For example, girls, briefcase, boys, briefcase, or group 1, briefcase, group 2, briefcase. Finally, we move to individual drilling. We select individual students and ask them to pronounce the word. This progression is important because it builds confidence. Students first hear a good model, then practice together, then practice in smaller groups, and finally demonstrate their pronunciation individually. The word anatomy board. After drilling, we move to writing. This stage establishes the written form of the target language. Boarding the word highlights 3 important aspects: spelling, stress, and word class. First, we write the word clearly. For example, briefcase. Then we make the stress clear. In briefcase, the first part receives the strongest stress. Brief, case. The word class should also be identified. Briefcase is a noun. This is important because students need more than just the meaning of a word. They also need to understand how the word behaves as language. So when presenting a new word, think about its meaning, pronunciation, spelling, stress, and grammatical category. Entering the demo room. Now we are going to move from theory to classroom application. In the following examples, we will apply the complete CECDW framework to more advanced vocabulary and compound nouns. As you watch these examples, pay attention to the sequence. We will see how the teacher establishes context, elicits the target, checks the concept, drills pronunciation, and finally introduces the written form. The purpose is not simply to memorize the 5 letters. The purpose is to develop a repeatable classroom routine that teachers can use when presenting new language. Demo 1. Defining briefcase. Let's start with the word briefcase. First, we establish the context using a picture. The teacher shows students a picture of a briefcase and says something like, "Look at this. It is a bag. It starts with B." Students are encouraged to think of the target word. This is the elicitation stage. A student may say, briefcase. Now the teacher checks the meaning. For example, Do you usually use a briefcase for a holiday or for business? Students answer, business. Now we move to drilling. The teacher models, briefcase, briefcase, briefcase. Then the students repeat chorally, followed by group and individual drilling. Finally, we introduce the written form. Briefcase. We identify it as a noun and make the stress clear. Brief, case. Notice how each stage has a specific purpose. We do not rush directly to the written word. We build understanding step by step. Demo 2. Nuance and physicality. Our second demonstration focuses on two important challenges: cultural meaning and physical characteristics. Let's begin with the word cocktail. This word is a good example of why cultural meaning matters. The presentation points out that in Arabic, the word cocktail can commonly refer to a fruit mixture. However, in English, cocktail can refer to an alcoholic drink served in a bar. Therefore, if we simply translate the word, students may develop the wrong meaning. Instead, we can use a cultural CCQ such as, are they alcoholic? This allows us to check the intended meaning. Then we establish the written form and stress. Cock, tails. Now let's look at the word, cardigan. We can use physical CCQs. Is it made of wood or wool? Students answer, wool. Then, does it have buttons in the front? Yes. And, do we wear it over or under our clothes? Over. These questions help students build a clear mental picture of the word. The lesson here is important. Do not assume that translation automatically gives students the correct concept. Sometimes we need to clarify cultural meaning or physical characteristics. Demo 3. Scale and compound rules. Now let's look at two more examples, huge and midwife. First, consider the adjective, huge. We show students a picture of a fisherman holding an enormous fish. The word starts with H. We can then ask a scale-based CCQ. Does huge mean small, big, or very big? Students answer, very big. This is a quick and effective way to check the meaning. Now let's look at midwife. This is a compound noun. We can establish the context using a picture of a medical professional working in a hospital. We can then ask questions about the job and the situation. For example, the teacher sets the context by saying, Sarah is pregnant. She goes to the hospital, and a midwife helps her during the birth. He then asks, is Sarah having a baby? Yes. Does the midwife help Sarah? Yes. Does the midwife help during the birth? Yes. Is the midwife helping Sarah learn English? No. Finally, we focus on pronunciation and stress. The presentation highlights the compound word stress rule. In many compound nouns, the main stress falls heavily on the first part. So we say, midwife. The important point is that pronunciation and stress should not be treated as an afterthought. They are part of the language presentation process. The CECDW Master Lesson Planner. Let's bring everything together in a practical lesson planning format. We have 5 columns corresponding to CECDW. Target word, context, elicitation, CCQs, drilling, writing. Let's take briefcase as an example. The target word is briefcase. The context is a picture. The elicitation prompt is, it's a bag starting with B. The CCQ is, holiday or business. Then we drill, teacher 3 times, followed by choral, group, and individual drilling. Finally, we write, briefcase, noun. The same process can be applied to cardigan, midwife, and huge. This is useful for lesson planning because it forces the teacher to think through the presentation before entering the classroom. Instead of asking yourself, how will I explain this word? You can ask, what is my context? How will I elicit it? What do I need to check? How will I drill it? How will I present the written form? That makes vocabulary presentation more intentional and consistent. The framework for better teaching. Let's finish by bringing the whole framework together. There are 3 key principles to remember. First, anchor everything. Do not present new language without a visual, situational, or narrative context. Students need something meaningful to connect the new language to. Second, test the ambiguity. Use concept-checking questions when a word is culturally specific or conceptually unclear. And remember to keep your CCQs simple and focused. Third, close the loop. Move from verbal repetition to the written form. Students should not only hear and say the word, they also need to see how it is written and, where appropriate, notice stress and word class. So, the complete CECDW sequence is: contextualize, elicit, concept check, drill, write. The real value of this framework is that it transforms vocabulary presentation from a guessing game into a predictable teaching pipeline. As teachers, our goal is not simply to introduce more words. Our goal is to make new language meaningful, understandable, pronounceable, and memorable. Thank you for watching, and I hope this framework gives you a practical structure that you can apply immediately in your own classroom.